I thought my life wasn't worth living a lot of the time, which is a terrible, terrible way to live.
Yeah.
And then to have simply a change in diet have that profound an effect, to go from that to feeling optimistic almost every day of my life, is just, it's hard to even imagine if you haven't experienced it.
Mm-hmm. Now, at that time, were you seeing conventional treatment from a psychiatrist or a neurologist?
Yeah.
Did you tell them, like, I'm going to get off these meds because I changed my diet?
I had a really lucky turn of events. I had started the carnivore diet, or the ZC diet as we called it at the time, and I was on a low dose of a medication. I was also on thyroid medication. And shortly after I started the carnivore diet, I got pregnant. I did end up going back on the carnivore diet as soon as my baby was born, and I was still nursing, so I didn't have any more meds, and I just never needed them again. And so I never went back to the psychiatrist.
Should write her a letter if she's still practicing. Like, you wouldn't believe it. Yeah.
Yeah. My ex saw her on the bus one time and told her the story, and she was kind of speechless.
Didn't know what to say.
No, I mean, what would you say? It sounds ridiculous.
Today's show with Amber is brought to you by our pals over at blueblocks.com, the leaders in blue light filtering protective eyewear that actually looks good and fits nice and snugly on your face, that can even be made and customized if you need prescription lenses for your blue light filtering glasses. So why should you care about this? The data is out showing that screen usage not only causes digital eye strain, but it can actually affect some of the neurons and literally rewire your brain in a negative way. So if you're like me and you're spending a lot more time, whether it's good or bad, on your screens because you can't see real people and we're distancing ourselves from other humans, I think you should be protecting your eyes using blue light filtering lenses that have been validated in comparison to all the other cheapies that are found on Amazon. Blueblocks.com, they actually study and validate their lenses, and you can get a wide variety of lenses. I like these amber ones at night. I wear their computer glasses during the daytime, and it's really important. So you can go over to blueblocks.com. That's BLUBLOX.com. Again, blueblocks.com to save on protective eyewear that can help you minimize digital eye strain and really support your body's circadian rhythms. Because as we're going to talk very soon with Amber O'Hearn, mental health and circadian rhythms are intimately connected. We're going to really dive into the carnivorous diet and how avoidance of dietary antigens affect your mood and mental well-being. And there's a lot of good data here. And the seminar that Amber O'Hearn and I talk about, CarnivoreCon in Boulder, Colorado, is occurring this August. So definitely check it out. I'll put links below. It's a really informative discussion, especially right now where mental health and emotional issues are running, unfortunately, at an all-time high with all this uncertainty. So it's a timely discussion. I really hope you enjoy it. And if you do, please hit that like button. And let's cut back to it with Amber. Amber, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're in this beautiful, I'll do some B-roll shots, but we're just north of Boulder, just outside of Longmont. Beautiful country. So you must get a lot of like creative insights here, just like seeing there's a lot of cattle around us and just beautiful mountains. So I was telling you offline, I used to live out here and I just really miss the environment, in Boulder.
It is beautiful. It's very light. There's a lot of sunshine here. It's known for that.
Yeah. And coming from, you grew up in Nova Scotia, and that's kind of the opposite, right? Because you're so far north.
Yeah, it's very foggy and moist and cloudy all the time.
Must be pretty, though. I mean,
it's gorgeous and green, yeah.
Yeah. So I consider you to be an innovator in the whole carnivorous diet field. You started this, and I want to get into your story a little bit, in 2009, So 2009, I think it was like 3 or 4 years after the whole paleo diet thing started to come online. And I think it's really courageous of you to just realize that maybe these anti-nutrients or these fibrous compounds in vegetables may not be so good for me. So what kind of inspired you, and how did you get motivated or, so curious into just kind of eliminating all vegetable matter in your diet back then?
Well, I didn't really go willingly like that. I didn't think my way to it. I had to start thinking about it after. But what happened was I was just really frustrated in where I was with my health. I'd been already eating a low-carb diet for about a dozen years, and that was really good for me. But over the course of a decade or so, I had gradually gained weight again, and I was just looking for some missing piece. And when I came across just a very obscure forum where some people were eating only meat, I thought, well, maybe I just need a kind of tune-up where it's really more strict low carb. And that's all I was thinking of it as. I didn't really put the pieces together that plants might actually have something that was detrimental to me, and it took me a long time to get to that. But what happened was I tried it, and it was just so incredibly effective and beneficial for my health in so many ways that then I had to say, wait a minute, maybe some of my assumptions are wrong.
Right. So this was like an online forum back then. Do you remember the website, or was it just...
Yeah, it was called Zeroing In on Health.
Okay.
It was run by Charles Washington, and Dana Spencer was also an admin at the time.
Okay.
And it was very small, and it had been an offshoot from a sub-forum on Jimmy Moore's site, where they had decided they wanted their own space and their own sort of control over what was being talked about. And so there was just like a ragtag group of people who had decided they were going to try this, and were starting to notice not only was it helping people who had a background like me, that is, they had been on low carb, but they just weren't getting everything they wanted or had gotten to a stall, or who were just kind of curious about it and had tried this approach of just eating meat. And by meat, I mean like animal foods, so it could be eggs. And some people were eating dairy, but it was just dropping the plants. And so it was interesting that they were calling it zeroing in on health, because there was always that emphasis that I didn't really appreciate at the beginning. It wasn't zeroing in on weight, it was zeroing in on health, but almost everyone who came there initially came for the weight.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, going back in your story a little bit, were you vegan for a little while in there somewhere?
A short while I was. So I was brought up vegetarian, and I think it was good vegetarian, like not... It wasn't this kind of straw man, like, just eating a bunch of... Yeah. My parents were poor, and so we ate a lot of greens and legumes, in part for that reason. But also there was a sort of ethical component about kindness to animals. And so we didn't cook meat at home almost ever. We had eggs and milk. And I wasn't disallowed from eating meat, so I did get it from time to time at my grandparents' house or out at a restaurant. But basically, I was brought up with a vegetarian ethos and a vegetarian diet.
So that must have been hard initially to kind of grapple with mentally, right? Like well, I want to do what's best for my health, but what about these animals? And I think that is a big stumbling block for a lot of people. And I think it kind of creates some sort of confusion and a lot of emotional resistance when people on the internet say, hey, I'm going to try a carnivorous diet or a zero-carb diet and so forth. And for my health, a lot of people react to that with, well, what about the animals? What about the environment? And so how did you kind of mentally navigate that in 2009?
Well, in 2009, I was already a meat eater. I think that for whatever reason, the ethical animal arguments weren't that compelling to me. I never saw it as torture or any of these things, because I think that you can give an animal a beautiful life and gently take their life and use it to support your own. I don't think those are necessarily at odds. Of course, they can be, and I think it's important to care about the animals that your life depends on. But for me, the biggest stumbling block was just that I had this idea that that health had to depend on plants, and that it was just a more natural thing for us. And I don't know where I really got those ideas. They hadn't been things I had examined critically. It was just something that I sort of by osmosis took into my worldview.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of us naturally, and I don't even know where it comes from, but plants are healthy. We need these fibers, we need the phytonutrients, we need the antioxidants, and so when people hear that you're going to have a diet that's devoid of those things, there's a lot of resistance that comes up. So yeah, where do you think that comes from? Is it just schooling, just something that we've heard over and over again?
I think repetition does make a lot of it, yeah. So there's the official kinds of education about whole grains being the basis of a healthy diet. But I had already, of course, by the time I got to the zero carb forum, I had already given up grains and legumes, but not from a kind of paleo standpoint. You had mentioned that paleo had become quite popular by this time, but I wasn't very persuaded by it yet. I thought that paleo, in fact, I thought the whole reason it worked was because of the carbs. That's how deeply I had internalized the idea that carbs were the source of the problem. And I think that's because ditching the carbs had such a profound effect on my own weight and health when I did that, that I thought, why do you even need any other explanation? But I do think that the grains and the legumes as the basis of a diet is a big, it's part of just things that we think we know and we're told from a very young age. It takes it takes a bit of work to rethink that.
Right. It's challenging. I mean, sometimes I admit I struggle with, I'll go like weeks with no fiber, but then there's this little thing in the back of my mind, like, gosh, shouldn't I have fiber? I mean, what about this? What about that? So it's very interesting. But again, I want to weave in a little bit more to your story and then get into some of these nuances of the diet. But mental health, I think, was a big reason too as well. And I think the people that I've heard, at least on social media, that benefit from going on a carnivore style diet, primarily, I mean, I think a lot of people benefit, but primarily autoimmune disease and mental health. And then you mentioned body composition. What did you notice from a mental health standpoint and mood initially, and maybe how long into eating this way did some of those feelings kind of diminish?
Yeah, well, I have a long history of mental health problems, actually, and I never connected them with diet. It didn't even really occur to me to, because it's you either think of it as psychiatric or, well, physiological, but the brain has this kind of special status that we don't think of being affected in the same way that we do. For, say, heart disease, you might think about diet, but mental health, people don't really. So I had depression, which I was first diagnosed with when I was 20. It was eventually considered treatment-resistant major depressive disorder, meaning that I would go on antidepressants and it might help a little bit for a little while, but it wasn't really resolving. And no one knew why, and I just hung out on antidepressants for a really long time without anything getting better. But then, in my 30s, I started experiencing different kinds of mood disturbances, and I was eventually re-diagnosed with a form of bipolar disorder, type 2 bipolar. And the difference is just that in traditional bipolar, you will have periods of actual psychotic breaks of mania. And in bipolar type 2, you have the depressive states, but you don't have the psychotic breaks. So when I got re-diagnosed, I was actually really excited about it. It was intimidating because, of course, it sounds really serious, and it is. But I thought, well, maybe this is why all this time I've never come across a solution, because I had the wrong diagnosis. And maybe now I'll get the help that I need, get the right drugs that I need, and everything will be better. But in fact, things just got worse.
Wow.
Each drug had side effects and didn't really help very much. So things were just getting worse and worse. So it was at that stage of my life, at the end of 2008, where my mood disorder had gotten worse and my weight had gotten worse, way worse. I was almost 200 pounds. Wow. And I didn't link them then, and even until years after, I didn't really fully make the connection, but now I think they're quite intimately linked. But what happened was I tried this all-meat diet, and I immediately started dropping weight rapidly. So first of all, like a pound every couple of days. Wow. But at the same time, I felt really good. Now one could say, well, finally this goal is happening, so of course you're going to feel happy and excited. And I knew that there might be a component of that. But after a couple of weeks, I just felt more like myself in a way that's kind of hard to describe. And when I brought it up with my husband at the time, he said, I didn't even know how to bring this up, but you just seem more stable than I've ever seen you in my life. Now, of course, when you have bipolar, you're not going to say, in 2 weeks, now I know it's cured, right? Because this is a long-term progressive disease, and you might have 2 weeks where you feel great. And so, I kind of kept back from making any major conclusions. But after staying on that diet for a very long time, it became increasingly clear that my mood problem had basically vanished.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Now, mechanistically, what do you think is going on there? I mean, there's probably a lot, right? Like blood sugar stability and less inflammation and this and that. But this has now been like 11 years, 12 years. If you could tease apart, and speculate, what do you think it was?
Well, it's a great question, and I've tried a whole bunch of different hypotheses and never so far really found one that either that completely explains it or that I completely understand. In the beginning, I thought, because I came from that very carb-centric model, I thought maybe it's just really down to the amount of carbohydrates. Maybe there's even fiber could be so, even a small amount. Maybe I have some kind of microbe that's driving my health problems, and even a tiny bit of feeding them will send me off kilter. And I decided that wasn't probably it, in part because I have tried addressing microbes, and I also don't have any lab results that would indicate that was something that was the real contributor to my problem. And also, not only that, but a plant-free diet is not necessarily a low-carb diet. So I could eat things that were higher in carbs, like dairy products or eggs or liver, for example, and I don't have that reaction, so I don't think it's really about the carbs. Then I started following Dr. Georgia Eads' work, and she said something that is not necessarily novel news, but to me it was a complete brain flip turnaround idea that plants aren't really there for your benefit. Like, actually they're organisms with their own motivations in a functional sense, and they don't want to be eaten. Any plant that makes itself available to be eaten, unless you've got some very complex kind of symbiosis going on, is going to be detrimental to the plant. And that's particularly true if you're eating parts of their body that they need to survive, or reproductive parts, for example. So I came to learn that plants, because most of them can't move very fast, they tend to have other kinds of defenses. So they have some more physical barrier ones like shells or thorns, but they're also full of chemicals that are actually a defense mechanism. They're basically pesticides. And so when we eat plants, even the ones that we have bred to be lower in toxicity, they always have some level of toxicity. And I thought, well, maybe that's the problem. Maybe the plants are somehow poisoning me. Now, it does still create a conundrum, because obviously lots of people eat plants and don't have the problems that I have. So what I've come to decide is that I have developed some kind of vulnerability that makes the toxins that are in plants, makes me open to them.
More uniquely susceptible for some reason.
Yes, such that when I take them out, I feel better.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting, right? Because some of these so-called anti-nutrients or defense mechanisms have been studied or have purported health benefits. Sulforaphane is one. So how do you kind of grapple with this mentally, to differentiate these purported health benefits of these defense mechanisms, sulforaphane being one, the phytoalexins and resveratrol, Japanese knotweed, things like that, because there's two schools of camps, your camp and then the phytonutrient camp. How do we make sense of this?
Well, that's a really great question. I love that question, because I think that so there is a response that you can have to certain chemicals in plants where your body will actually make itself stronger in a way when it's presented with a bit of a toxin. And so some people will say, well, actually, you need to eat these plants to keep your body strong enough to fight off whatever it needs. It's almost like a kind of immunization model. And of course, they'll use the word hormesis for it. The reason that I find that not quite so compelling, there are a couple reasons. One is that usually the amounts that are involved are so high that you can't necessarily get it by eating a sort of natural amount of the compound. So if you take, for example, sulforaphane, you really need to eat, like, I don't remember the exact amount, but like maybe a pound of broccoli sprouts a day, and then the sprouts are not all of the same concentration. If you compare different ones off the shelf, I read a paper that was actually all about how to get enough sulforaphane, and the authors concluded that it just wasn't realistic to try to get a therapeutic dose out of a natural food, and that's why they're trying to figure out the best methods for isolating and concentrating. And the same thing might be said about the curcumins and resveratrol, and I think those are the top three for the efficacy that's been studied.
Right.
So that's one problem, is it seems a little bit contrived and not necessarily something that you could argue that humans were evolved to depend on. But then a second problem that I have with it is that the mechanism of action goes through a molecular pathway, which is usually called NRF2, and that pathway is actually stimulated by being on a ketogenic diet. And so there's this question of, if you're already getting that stimulation through a ketogenic diet, is there any extra added benefit from getting it from a plant source? And I can't tell that there is, in part because we don't have very good measurements of how much the dose is. And if you're talking about hormesis, you're talking about something where the dose gets better and better and better, and then it gets toxic. And if you don't even know what dose you need to get better, you could actually be veering into the other side. And how would you, for an individual, figure out how much you should be getting?
That's an excellent point. I didn't realize that the state of nutritional ketosis increases NRF2.
It does.
Yeah, let's talk more about that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, so what it does is there's a really interesting interaction with keto adaptation. So when you first start a ketogenic diet, you will increase the oxidative stress. And what happens is that over the process of keto adaptation, the cell will start creating its own antioxidants in the same way that it does in response to a phytochemical. But after the process of keto adaptation, it appears, at least in some studies in rodents, that the balance now is tipped in the favor of the antioxidation on a ketogenic diet, and so it all works through AMPK, as far as I understand.
Right. Very fascinating. I mean, there's a lot of, how do you say, survival circuits. David Sinclair has kind of talked about that, induced through this more kind of fat-adapted phenotype, which I think is really, really fascinating, and a lot of people don't really realize that. And along those lines, I didn't want to interrupt you when you were talking about, like, before you realize Georgia Eads, her notion of these anti-nutrients found in plants, you found a lot of benefit just with your own body composition with regards to, restricting the carbohydrates per se. There's a lot of people that will say, oh yeah, well, if you go low carb or keto, you're naturally reducing your calories. So it's really not the calories coming from carbohydrates. It's really the deficit created from, the restricting that particular food group.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because what happens if you say you spontaneously reduce calories? To me, that means that your fat stores are providing enough energy that you feel satiated. So if it's all about a deficit of calories, you could try manipulating calories directly and forget about the carbs. What happens if you say you give yourself what you believe is a caloric deficit of 300 calories or something like that? Yeah. If you don't feel satiated, that indicates to me that your body fat stores are just not providing what they're supposed to be providing, and you're actually not getting what you're supposed to be getting under the caloric deficit. Whereas if you spontaneously reduce by 300 calories, that says to me that's how much flow of fat you were naturally getting. So it's possible that you could reduce I don't actually think that it works all the time. It might work in some cases. It's possible that you could reduce the calories and get the same effect if your fat stores are cooperating. But if they are cooperating, you should get that satiety, and it should feel like you spontaneously did it. So I kind of feel like if you don't get a spontaneous calorie drop, you're fighting against your body, not with your body, and you're not actually getting the fat from your stores in a way that you might expect you are.
That's a really good point. I never considered it in that regard, and it makes a lot of sense because, a lot of people that go on a diet, they're hungry all of the time. They're craving foods and things like that, and people that are naturally eating like a carnivorous or a ketogenic style diet report that they're satiated, they're full, they don't need to have these snacks and things, and I was just talking with Dr. Berry this weekend, and another mechanism that I think is kind of interesting is the reduction in baseline inflammation that lends itself to more volitional activity. So people's, if you want to look at the energy in, energy out hypothesis, people are just doing more volitional activity, to go mow the lawn. They feel better. They don't have the aches and pains in their joints that was causing them to just sit around and maybe overconsume foods, which I think is fascinating. Now, along those lines, that's one of the things that I think is really interesting about going on the carnivorous diet is people that had previously high levels of inflammation, C-reactive protein, ferritin, everything, those things seem to drop. And that, I think, is really confusing for a lot of people that will say, well, this whole foods plant-based diet is very anti-inflammatory and all this. So do you think that's a big mechanism kind of at play here, is the inflammation?
I do. So inflammation is your body's way of healing. Right? So whenever there's inflammation going on, that means that something asked for inflammation. There's damage, and your body's saying, we need to respond to this damage by creating inflammation. And so if your food is anti-inflammatory in the sense of you're giving medicine that reduces your body's inflammation response, that doesn't necessarily reduce the damage response. So there's two ways to reduce inflammation, right? You can hide it or knock out your response to damage, or you can reduce the damage itself, which then causes less need for inflammation. And so I think when you see a claim that such and such a food is inflammatory or anti-inflammatory, you've got to ask, what does that mean? Does it mean it's reducing the need for inflammation, or does it mean it's fighting your body and preventing your response? So in a lot of ways, I think that plant-based claims are often saying this component, and it comes back to those isolated, concentrated components that we don't even know have that effect at a food level, has been shown to reduce inflammation. Is that because it's helping your body to fix something, and then you don't need as much inflammation, or is it just interfering?
It's a great way to look at it. Something else, before we kind of dive deeper, that I wanted to talk to you about, I didn't think I'd bring it up, but given that would you say that you're fully recovered from mental health stuff? Like I think and I speak for myself, I think a lot of us are susceptible, when the days are dark, where there's stress, and in the winter months, as we film this in early January, we can feel a little down. Do you think depression exists in the sense that, is it something, it's feedback from your body, right? But do you think that it's like, a lot of people struggle through their entire life, and like you experience, going on this medicine or this medicine, and it's not really restoring the root cause of the problem. So is it a response to the body, or how do you view depression from a teleological perspective now?
Well, it's a little complicated. I think that in a lot of people's minds, and in my mind previously, my model of what depression was either came down to a disorder of thinking or some kind of chemical imbalance. Of course, you can't have one without the other. I don't want to be a dualist about it, right? But a lot of the things that I did to try to address depression when I was younger was to pay close attention to my thoughts and try to be very aware of when I'm thinking all or nothing things, or when I'm going for all these cognitive biases that, if I think about life this way, of course I'll feel depressed, and you can try to manage the way you think. the funny thing about that is that even though I could see how useful that was, it never really helped me when I was feeling depressed. But when I stopped feeling depressed, these skills became super awesome. I mean, now I'm in a much better position to actually make use of all that cognitive therapy that I did when I was depressed that didn't help me then. The balance theory, I think, is also not quite right, because if you're conceiving of your depression as something like, oh, you've got too little dopamine or something like that, it begs the question in the same way that a calories in, calories out model might, right? So why do you have too little dopamine? Or why do you have too little serotonin? And if you do something that intercepts at the receptor level and says, okay, we're going to prevent you from taking this back up, does that really solve the problem? I don't think it really does, because I think your body is striving for some kind of homeostatic set point in terms of neurotransmitters that just manipulating it at the receptor level isn't really addressing. So I do feel like my ability to cope with stress and things that would normally cause a person to be unhappy. I mean, I have happy times and unhappy times like everybody else. But I used to be just thrown in a hole in a way that I'm just much more resilient. And it made me become much more of a believer in the physiology of the brain, even though I want to, in a kind of romantic way, think that I can think my way through anything. The role that physiology has played has been very humbling.
I love that, because we do hear about kind of, and if I could kind of add some nomenclature, I think, just to make me help remember it better. You were talking about kind of a top-down approach. Like, I'm feeling depressed, I can't have these feelings, I got to think happy thoughts and be optimistic. But you kind of worked on both. You started top-down, then bottom-up diet, getting the foundation, maybe calming down inflammatory processes in the body that were aggravating your brain and causing these neurotransmitter imbalances. So I think approaching it from two angles is really unique. And I feel like not a lot of neurologists or psychiatrists, but I feel like the conversation is being more and more talked about, which is really nice for people. But I went through a bout of depression as well, overtraining in college, wanted to be a pro bike racer, but then I thought it was all my thoughts and things like that too. But at that time, I was consuming a lot of soy protein. I worked at this vitamin store, and the cheapest protein powder I could get was this soy protein. And I can't say that was I think it was a trigger, a big trigger, because I had these dark days. It was January 2006. Like, I couldn't get off the couch. I was like thinking about suicide. I'm like, what in the hell? Like, I've never had these feelings before. And then that's how I found paleo. But it was really interesting that, that some compounds, and whether or not it was only that protein or that was an exacerbator, can totally affect the brain in a negative way. And I think this is an important conversation, because mental health, especially amongst people in their teens and 20s right now, the rates of suicide and depression are sky high. And people are blaming it on tech and technology and screens and social media. But we know in those individuals, there's a big push for plant-based and do what's right for the environment. And so I think this conversation can be very helpful for people to realize that your diet can be a major factor for your mental state, and don't recognize that. So
yeah, it's surprising the amount. I mean, just mind-blowing, really, to think. I mean, if you just take my experience, which is the one that's closest to me, I was suffering psychiatric horror, really. I felt a lot of suicidal tendencies. I thought my life wasn't worth living a lot of the time, which is a terrible, terrible way to live. Yeah. And then to have simply a change in diet have that profound an effect, to go from that to feeling optimistic almost every day of my life, is just, you can't even, it's hard to even imagine if you haven't experienced it.
Mm-hmm. Now, at that time, were you seeing conventional treatment from a psychiatrist or a neurologist?
Yeah.
Did you tell them, like, I'm going to get off these meds because I changed my diet?
I had a really lucky turn of events. I had started the carnivore diet, or the ZC diet as we called it at the time, and I was on a low dose of a medication. I was also on thyroid medication. And shortly after I started the carnivore diet, I got pregnant. And so I had to go off all my meds because it wasn't clear that they were safe.
Yeah.
So I did that, and as I've mentioned to other people, I didn't stay completely carnivore during my pregnancy. I didn't even stay completely low carb, and that's partly to do with a hereditary condition I have called hyperemesis, where you're very prone to vomiting when you're pregnant, not just like the morning sickness at the beginning, but all through. A lot of people get hospitalized. And so there were a lot of times when I ate food just to kind of soothe my stomach. But in any case, I did end up going back on the carnivore diet as soon as my baby was born. And I was still nursing, so I didn't have any more meds. And I just never needed them again. And so I never went back to the psychiatrist.
Should write her a letter if she's still practicing. Like, you wouldn't believe it. Yeah.
Yeah, my ex saw her on the bus one time and told her the story, and she was kind of speechless.
She didn't know what to say.
No, I mean, what would you say? It sounds ridiculous.
Right. She's like, okay, whatever. Wow. Gosh, I mean, now, how did you discover George Eads? Was that back in that era, or was this as of late?
No, it was back in that first year. I came across a video of hers from the Ancestral Health Symposium. Her talk was called Little Shop of Horrors. And it was all about plants and how they might not be as benign as you might assume, or certainly as how I assumed. So I watched that, and then I looked up her website and read what she was doing, and I've just been a huge fan. Yeah.
I didn't realize, so she's been doing this a long time as well, a very long time.
Well, she's been studying diet and the effect of plants for a long time, and I think she was on a very carefully crafted elimination diet for many years, and I think she started carnivore about 2 years ago.
Okay.
Time flies.
Yeah, that's impressive. That's really, really cool. She seems like a great person. I've only talked to her a handful of times.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe if we can kind of drill down on some things, because again, you have the Carnivore Symposium that's going on this May of 2020 here in Boulder, Colorado, which is awesome. I'll put links below, friends. You definitely got to check that out. But I'm sure you've received just ton. I think Twitter's you're most active on Twitter, so you received probably a litany of messages. I had this condition and I tried carnivore and this happened. What are some main conditions that you hear people getting like a resolution in?
Well, it's funny that you talk about the social media, because I do get more private messages than I can handle. So I just want to, since I've got this opportunity, make a public apology if you've sent me a message and I haven't replied. It's just that I'm a little bit flooded. Yeah. And many of those questions are I wouldn't have the credentials to answer, because you would require a history, and there might be something medical going on. But when I do hear from people who just write to me to say, hey, I want to thank you for turning me on to this idea because I've resolved such and such, it's very often mood related, and I think that's partly because that's something that I've openly talked about, so people want to connect with me about that. But I've also seen people who do have the autoimmune connection resolution, so things like arthritis, asthma, skin conditions like eczema or psoriasis, and also GI issues. And I think there's kind of a double thing going on there. First of all, if you've got GI issues, then putting a lot of fiber through the system can often just exacerbate it, and that can just be maybe a physical thing. But I also think that there are GI conditions that are autoimmune related, like Crohn's, for example, and colitis have an autoimmune component, and so it's kind of hitting it from both sides. It's funny that we're making this distinction, because I only started considering this recently, but I think that maybe the mood problems like bipolar also could be an an autoimmune-like disease. I don't really like the word autoimmune because it has implications about the mechanism that we're not really that sure of. But one thing that I think happens in autoimmune, and I'm speculating, but there are theories that it has to do with an inappropriate openness of the intestinal barrier, right? And so if you remember when I was saying I didn't really get the paleo aspect, thought it was all down to it being lower carb by virtue of having lower grains, I did learn that there were specific components in grains and legumes that are connected to autoimmune, but I discounted it again because I thought, well, I don't have an autoimmune disorder. But I've more recently thought, well, maybe actually I do. And maybe the blood-brain barrier has susceptibilities that are similar to the intestinal barrier.
Have you done any testing in that regard? I know Cyrex does a few different antibody tests. That would be fascinating to see.
I'd love to get a list from you of recommendations.
Yeah, I have no financial affiliation with the company, but a friend of mine, Tatis Karazian, and Aristova's Johnny started this company a few years ago to help people to better ascertain if their body's making antibodies to the different barriers and things. The kitty cat.
This guy wants to join us.
Yeah, that's awesome. People love.
My carnivore friend.
Yeah, right. That's really amazing. So, have you done any genetic testing at all either? Be curious to see.
Yes. It's been a while, but I did a 23andMe scan several years ago. I didn't find anything that was too persuasive or enlightening, but it's nice to have that there in case something comes up.
Yeah, like the HLA-DQ. Some of these different antigen receptors and things might be kind of interesting, and polymorphisms. But yeah, so and is that kind of a theme that you're talking about in the book about the permeability of the gut and how potentially going on a carnivorous diet could help with that?
A little bit. I think it's a good candidate for a mechanism. I know that the people, I don't know if you know about the clinic ICMNI in Hungary. They used to be called Paleomedicina.
Okay, so they changed their name. Yeah,
yes.
I'm familiar.
And that is their number one theory for why this diet is helping. And so they're the ones who really turned me on to that. I went to visit them a couple of years ago.
Oh, cool.
It was wonderful, wonderful experience. And that's when I really began to take that theory seriously and realize that it might actually apply to me.
Right. Along those lines, there's some theories out there speculating, and I used to really be kind of dogmatic about this. I've interviewed a few different people. Jeff Leach, he's quantifying the diversity of unindustrialized humans and their microbiomes, and finding there's a disparity between bacteriodiversity and people in Tanzania, for example, and parts of Siberia that are unindustrialized, and Westerners and Europeans, we have really low bacteriodiversity, and he's looked at their diets and sees that their dietary diversity is high and made these correlations. So I was really big on dietary diversity. Get all these phytonutrients, flavonoids, fibers, and all that. And so it was mentally a hard thing to grapple with, accepting a more diverse diet that is, consumed when you eat a carnivorous diet, but yet all these people with conditions that are historically characterized by low bacterial diversity are benefiting. So that was a hard thing to grapple with. But what are your thoughts on bacterial diversity?
Well, I think when we first started realizing that that the gut microbiome is a huge, diverse population that's right within our bodies, and that it was having a lot of, potentially having a lot of effects throughout the body, the first thing that happened was correlations started being drawn in studies where you would take people and measure different strains or populations and make associations between their state of health and what you're seeing inside them. And I think that's a really good start. But it also comes back to a principle that maybe has been forgotten along the way, which is we're going to assume that the biome of a healthy person is what characterizes a healthy biome. So if you do something and it makes you a lot healthier, it's almost a conflict of logic to say, well, you're much healthier now, you can't be healthy because your biome isn't. Like it feels to me a little bit backwards. And one way so there's kind of two ways you might look at it. One is, well, you're healthy now, but from things we know about the biome, maybe there are consequences down the road that are not going to be good for you. And that we can't really know about that, and it's a legitimate question to ask. But on the other hand, it could be that all of the data that we have so far have been on people that are eating a high-carb, sort of plant-diverse diet. And maybe you need that kind of biome to deal with that kind of diet and be healthy. And so one idea that I have about why those results might not be generalizable is that if you're removing the plants from the diet and your gut biome changes, maybe it's changing in a way that would look very unhealthy if you were eating plants, but since they're not there, it doesn't matter so much.
That's beautiful. That does make a lot of sense. I've never heard, I know I haven't heard you articulate it in that way, but I know you've been diving into this for a while. And it seems that, the microbiome bugs kind of adapt to the diet. And like you said, maybe because you're getting all these different cellulose molecules and things like that, so then you need to support the proliferation of those bugs to deal. Wow, that's a really interesting thought.
Right, so if you're eating a lot of cabbage, say, and you don't have a microbiome that deals with that, you might see a result of illness because it's not coping with that food. And then you might see benefit from suggestions like, why don't you eat these fermented foods that are carrying along the kind of bacteria that would be useful for fermenting, breaking down the cabbage. But then if you're just not eating cabbage at all, maybe you don't actually need it.
What are your thoughts on fermented foods in general?
I think they're delicious. They don't agree with me. There was one point where I thought, well, actually, this looks just like the beginning of GAPS, so maybe I should start adding I've been on this for a long time. Maybe I should start adding fermented foods. And I pretty much immediately started feeling not good.
Wow.
Like tired and almost what I would describe as a histamine overreaction. And I don't know if that's because there are literally histamines in fermented foods, or if I'm just making that connection, like I didn't measure the histamines. But,
right. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like if people, and that's how I consume most of my vegetables now. If in the summer we'll have more greens and things like that, but more in moderation. I used to be, we'd overconsume food because of their purported health benefits, and then had GI issues, but kind of overlooked that and thought it was from something else. But anyhow, so yeah, fermentation. I think that's the way that if people are curious to weave in some of that, that's why I generally recommend to try, because it seems like it's partially digested. You're getting the bugs, makes sense. Going back to I guess dairy and then meal frequency. I guess maybe the big picture, how does your diet today look different from when you first started? Yeah.
It's changed a lot over the years through different phases. When I first started, I ate a lot of ribeye, which is kind of the stereotypical how to do a carnivore diet, right? And it worked really well for me. Obviously, it's a little bit, I hate to say this, it's not even true. I was going to say it's boring. It's not boring. It never gets boring. But I do sometimes want to branch out, and so I'd eat more chicken or pork, different cuts of meat. I started, growing up vegetarian, a lot of the cooking skills that I had or the meals that were familiar to me were not different types of meat. So I came to love things that might be just normal for other people, like beef ribs. Oh my goodness, I discovered beef ribs and pork belly and skirt steak, which I didn't know about. And just all of these different types of meat that I would get into a phase and just cook one thing for a while.
Right.
When there was a time, so I'm not at my lowest weight, and I had some health issues over the last couple years that I don't even fully understand the etiology of. I don't think it came from a difference in my diet. It's not like I started changing things. But what I was about to say was that when I was at my very lowest weight, my desire for fat actually increased quite a bit, which for some people you might think is counterintuitive, but I think it was just because there was less available body fat, and so I had to get more of it from my food. And I also, after I went to Hungary, when I was there, I tried a lot more organ meats. I've always liked, like liver, for example, and I've tried some different things like thymus, and I liked them. But what I tried there that I really, really liked was brain, and I got kind of on a brain kick for a while after that.
Yeah.
But I don't know, I don't think that my diet is strongly different from how it was. I'll include dairy now and then. It's not a big staple. I feel like it messes with my satiety a little bit. So sometimes I can gauge if I want to eat based on hunger or not by if a sort of plain meal of meat sounds good to me, or say a boiled egg. If a boiled egg sounds good to you, then you're probably hungry. But for me, sometimes I would want cheese, and I'd say to myself, would anything else do? No, only cheese. And then I know there's some kind of addictive quality to that for me.
Right? Cheese is very, it's craveable, I guess is the best way to put it. Yeah. So when you do have dairy, is it a raw cheese, raw milk? Do you kind of differentiate between?
Most of my dairy consumption is in the form of cream. I do drink coffee, that's my plant vice, and I mostly drink it black. But my first dairy go-to will be adding a little cream to my coffee. It feels a little indulgent.
Yeah.
Yogurt, I try to bring back now and then, and it's partly because of this idea that fermented foods might be good for me. But I almost always regret it because I can't put it down.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's fascinating. I used to buy milk from a raw dairy farmer just south of here on 63rd. So I know there's a lot of like raw, is it the A2A2 cows?
Yeah, I have a local source of that, and that's where I get yogurt if I get it.
Yeah.
And it's really good. I've had fermented colostrum from them as well.
Wow. Okay.
They don't always have it, but
when it's available, you try and get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. My wife wasn't producing a lot of breast milk early on when my daughter was born, so we supplemented with raw goat dairy, and that really, really helped my daughter. And I think it had to do. I think it helped her immune system in such a way. She's an only child and doesn't seem to get sick very often, and so that kind of hygiene hypothesis, getting the raw, whatever microbes are there from the farm, so to speak. So I think it's kind of interesting if people are going to do it. I frequently recommend find a farmer if you can. If you live in Manhattan, it's challenging, but I guess my cousin, have you heard about this? There's kind of this black market raw dairy thing going on.
No.
Yeah, so there was this like white truck that would pull up, and you had to know someone who would give you the number, and it would, at least in Manhattan, presumably it happens in other cities, where you can buy, there's like a market for raw dairy that's kind of under the table, cash only kind of thing.
It's interesting. I have really mixed feelings about it because, of course, there are microbes that you want to kill, right?
Yeah.
There can be very serious illness from that. And in fact, I had some illness, not last year, but the year before. I had a really terrible experience with salmonella poisoning, which probably was traced back to some... I had sort of hoped it was an egg problem because I'm really attached to beef, but the CDC always contacts people who have confirmed diagnoses to try to, narrow it down to what the source was. And they think that it was from eating raw beef, which I love, and I probably am not going to stop doing. But it is a serious risk.
Totally. With that is when you eat raw, how often do you eat raw beef?
There was a while where I was eating it about once a week. Now it's just from time to time.
In that situation, is it, do you know the farmer? Is it... Are you grass-fed, this and that? Like, how important do you think it is in that context?
I don't know. I don't know if a farmer that I know is more susceptible or less. The beef that was probably my source was from a small store, but it wasn't a single farmer. But I knew that they freshly ground it every morning, and I felt really good about it. So... I don't know. Interesting. Yeah. I also feel like, honestly, though, there's something about my own susceptibility that maybe made it worse. Because that was a point in time where my health was not as solid as it had been, and so it might have just been partly due to my own vulnerability.
Yeah, just the right circumstances, and yeah, or stressed out or not sleeping or whatever, right? I mean, yeah, it's very interesting. Okay, so in closing, what would you say to someone who's struggling with their health, but for philosophical reasons or ethical reasons, they're on a vegan or vegetarian diet, and they're just not willing at this point to even think about the idea of eating more animal products? Would you say, give it a shot for your health for 2 weeks? Like, what would you say to them if you were in an elevator or at a grocery store and they had a question for you?
It's a really tough question because we always want to do things that make us feel like we're living with integrity. One thing that I might say is you've got to put your own mask on first. So you can't be a help to the world and to the animals of the world and to the environment unless you're functioning at the best level that you can. And so if it turns out that your health would actually be drastically improved by eating meat, first of all, you might want to do that just so that you can be the best person you can be. And then second, you might want to, that's food for thought, right? If it's the case that that your physiology requires meat and is averse to plants in a way that you didn't understand, you may need to think about the ethics of taking care of you, because you are an animal, you are valuable to the world, no one is like you. And if you can't take care of you, no one can.
That is brilliant. I love that.
Thank you.
What a great piece of, that's really important. And if anyone's ever traveled on a commercial airline, that's one of the first things they say is, should we be unstable and the airbags deploy, even though if you have 3 kids, you can't help your kids if you can't breathe yourself, right? So they tell you to put your air mask on first. I love that. That's awesome. So Amber, everyone probably already follows you on Twitter that's watching, but if not, they're definitely going to follow you on Twitter. And this event going on in Boulder, Colorado for the 2nd annual event. Is it still at the Boulder Theater? Or?
It is,
Okay.
yes. It'll be at the Boulder Theater May 23rd and 4th, 2 full days. And we're going to have dinner both nights. Nice. I'm sure it'll be amazing.
Absolutely. And is it carnivoreconference.com, or what's the website?
Carnivorecon.com.
Carnivorecon. That's amazing. That's really cool. So since it's at the Boulder Theater, it will sell out. Right? You can't have.
I assume so because, it did last year. We sold out twice, actually. We had to move to try to accommodate more people. But because we are having dinner in-house, we can only sell so many seats. So I hate to say buy it now, but buy it now.
You need to do it.
I had a lot of people who were sad at the end, and I couldn't help them, even though I wanted to.
Right. And it's a great weekend. May, the weather is historically pretty good in Colorado during that time. So that's awesome. And you're working on a book. You want to talk about that?
Yes. So I have a book online. It's called Eat Meat, Not Too Little, Mostly Fat, which is also the name of a guide to eating carnivore that I did a couple of years ago. And I've written a couple of chapters. I'm releasing it chapter by chapter as I write it. And I'm really excited about it because it turns out I have a lot of ideas.
That's so cool. I like that kind of Michael Pollan spin,
I hope he forgives me.
I know, right? Yeah. Along those lines, Amber, we've asked now 300 people, this question. I personally think that how we're going to change health in this country and the world is going to be kind of a bottom-up approach, but obviously policymakers can influence things. It seems that the vegan diet and plant-based diet is getting a lot of influence and infusing into government recommendations, dietary guidelines. If you could meet or bump shoulders with a politician, what would you want them to know in 30, 40 seconds about how you feel people should eat and diets and legislation, things like that?
Oh, that's such a tough question. I think I would ask them if they really know where their evidence is coming from, and if they've thought about the long history and prehistory that humans have with meat and how it affects our evolution, and whether they think they really know the consequences of changing our diet in such a drastic way.
Brilliant. Love that. Final question, promise you. Okay, so if there's just, if someone said, Amber, the power grid's going to go out, but I can supply you a lifetime supply of this one cut or this one animal product, what would it be?
Life without worrying about like
Forever.
refrigeration and all that.
Yeah, all that's covered.
Oh boy. This is going to be silly, but I think it's got to be ribeye. It's got to be a ruminant, and it's got to be something fatty because the fat's super important. If it were just liver, for example, I think you would get overdoses of vitamins. So that's where I'd have to go. Yeah,
it's hard, right? Yeah, you bring up a really good point, and I think this is where people that don't watch podcasts or follow people like yourself on the internet, they try carnivore, they're used to lean meat, top sirloin, London broil, things like that. And it's just not satiating enough, I feel like, and you definitely need that fat. And again, this is going to take a long time for people to grapple with because they've been told, especially red fatty meat is linked with heart disease and all that, but it's really key for satiety and all that. I found that to be just me personally.
Yeah, protein's not a great source of calories. You don't want to be using it for that. You want to be using it for maintenance of all of your body structures. If you have to use it for energy, that's really hard on your body. And if you're not going to eat carbohydrates, then fat is where it's at.
Totally. Yeah, and if you're trying to compress your feeding window, doing intermittent fasting or OMAD, if you don't get that fat, it's damn near impossible, I've found, because like you said, the protein, maybe it can be back converted through gluconeogenesis to glucose and this and that, but it's getting it from the fat is just much easier. So,
yeah.
Amber, I'm so grateful for this opportunity to meet with you in your home in Boulder. Thank you so much for letting us in, and thanks for all your work and inspiration and ideas that you share on Twitter, and for just getting out there and putting on this conference, which is going to be amazing, in your book. I know it's in progress, your new book that you're working on, you're aiming for summer of 2020 range.
Yes.
Should be good. So I'll put links below. And if you all enjoyed this video, which I'm sure you did, please hit that like button and definitely subscribe. And please check out the links below and have an awesome day. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Mike. It was a great pleasure.